Okay, got that going. Cut the papers. Let's start. So, start with a quick recap. Last time what we finished was basically what people refer to as the Pre-Socratic Philosophers. So that's a whole chunk of philosophical history, the Pre-Socratic Philosophers. It's its own standalone little chunk. And we finished it last time with the Atoms. So I want to do a recap real quick through what are the Pre-Socratic Philosophers and the 5 big names that you should have a rough idea of who they are and what they did. And these are the big 5 from all the Pre-Socratics. And then we'll be starting the next chunk of philosophy, which is going to be the Sophists, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So from the Pre-Socratics, first name on the list, obviously, Thales. Thales of Miletus. He's the father of philosophy, father of science, father of math, father of it all. Famous for saying the one stuff is water, but first one to start asking these types of questions. We remember Pythagoras. Pythagoras was the one who starts describing nature using mathematics. He took it further than that. He said all of nature is mathematics. That's a step too far, but he's the first one to start describing nature using mathematics. And that's his big contribution. And he does a lot to develop mathematics. Thales gets a start as Pythagoras starts rigorously adding a bunch of new theorems of knowledge, him and his followers. Heraclitus, we remember what Heraclitus was famous for?
Hard to understand. Nothing is everything is becoming.
Nothing ever is, everything is becoming. Nothing ever is, everything is becoming. Everything is changing in every respect all the time. Now, he's one that I need to kind of hammer home, because if we were to say, out of these guys, who are the Sophists following? They're following Heraclitus. So we probably have a pretty good idea of why he rejected the laws of logic based off of change, right? If something is changing, then it both is and is not. What it was and was not, define the law of contradiction. You might remember when we covered him, he also denies that there's any actual entities in reality. He used change to argue that there's no such thing as a particular entity in reality. Remember this argument?
Yeah, the butterfly?
No. The only quote he says is you can't step into the same river twice. It's a different river. It's not the same thing. But the example we talked about was, imagine me and I'm just inhuman, insanely good modeling clay sculptor. So I got this big pile of modeling clay, and you watch me working away at it. And in 1 second it looks like the Empire State Building, the next second it looks like a light bulb, the next second it looks like a desk, the next second it looks like a giraffe, the next second it looks like a chair. And it's constantly changing all the time. And if I ask you, what is this thing, as I'm sitting here manipulating it, what would you call it?
Clay.
Modeling clay, maybe? You can't really call it anything else. Now imagine that the actual substance I was using was also changing. 1 second it's wood, the next second it's steel, the next second it's sand, the next second it's ice. So both the substance and the form of it are constantly changing all the time. What is it? Yeah. So if everything is changing in every respect at all times, then there's no such thing as a physical entity. That's Heraclitus. And you might remember he had a follower, Cratylus, who went so far as to stop talking.
Yeah.
Because words ultimately need a referent. If I were to ask you for a definition of something, you'd have to give me other words. If I ask you for the definition of all those words, you'd have to give me other words. Eventually, since you can't have an infinite regress of words, you need to just point to something. In reality, your words need to start with a referent, something physical. And since there are no physical entities, all words are ultimately meaningless. And so, he stopped talking. One of Heraclitus' followers, Cratylus. Okay, that was Heraclitus. Parmenides, often viewed as in contest with Heraclitus. Heraclitus says, Parmenides says, you're right, Heraclitus, change implies a contradiction, but since we can't have contradictions, we can't have change. Right? Parmenides, the universe is a one big ball of undifferentiated being, always has been and always will be, no such thing as change. Change is an illusion. He had 2 prominent followers, Zeno and Melissus, but pretty much giving the same doctrine. And then we went through Empedocles and Anaxagoras. They were the first pluralists, and they're trying to reconcile Heraclitus and Parmenides. They're trying to have a universe where we don't have what is becoming what is not, or what is not becoming what is, but at the same time we can have change. And the ultimate product of that was the Atomos with Democritus being the primary atomist. And what's the pithy little saying we memorized for the atomists? If you could describe Atomos philosophy in one sentence, what would you say? Are you raising your hand? Oh, you're thinking.
I know it. It's in here.
All that exists are atoms in the void. It's just atoms in the void. Everything is just atoms in motion. The void is what the atoms can move around in, but there's just atoms in the void. Right? Now we might remember he had a bit of a strange ethics to go with his metaphysics. So his metaphysics says there's just atoms in the void, but then his metaphysics implies complete determinism, so he's the first mechanistic materialist. He thinks that everything's just physical matter, and it's just physical matter moving how it's moving. And so this idea that you ever make a choice is a complete illusion. You never actually make a choice. You are just atoms in motion, vibrating how they're going to vibrate, they're going to do what they're going to do, and that's it. And then his ethics kind of just completely ignores his metaphysics, and he just decides he's going to have an ethics, and it kind of follows your typical Greek ethics. Talking about, it's good to be temperate, just, courageous, wise, and pious. Those are the 5 major Greek virtues talked about early on, soon to be reduced to 4. But his metaphysics was huge, the way he viewed reality, and you see how science kind of gets its foothold with Pythagoras and Democritus. Democritus with his atoms in the void, Pythagoras with numbers can somehow describe nature. You take these two together and you've got a good start for your foundation of science. Any question on any of these 5 before we move forward now? Nothing? All right. So now we will be talking about the Sophists. Our major Sophists that we'll be talking about is Protagoras and Gorgias. These are the big 2. And then these are kind of major footnote Sophists, but these are the 2 major Sophists. So these are the 2 names that a year from now, if I asked you who are the 2 prominent Sophists, you'd say those 2 and probably forget that these 2 ever existed. But we'll go over all 4 of them. There were tons of Sophists. These weren't all the Sophists. There's many Sophists. And to understand the Sophists, we need to remind ourselves of the political and economical situation going on in Greece. What's going on in Greece right now when the Sophists are coming onto the scene? Now, the Sophists are coming onto the scene right after the Greco-Persian War, right? And we remember what's happening at the end of the Greco-Persian War with Athens. Remember the Delian League? What's going on? Athens has just taken control. So at the end of the Greco-Persian War, well, not the end, but there comes a point in the Greco-Persian War where the Persians are completely kicked out of Greece. And the 2 powerhouses at the time were Sparta and Athens. And then there's this question, now that we have Persia out of Greece, should we continue the offensive and go and drive Persia out of all the Greek islands and out of Ionia along the coast of Asia Minor? Do I need a map, or do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Did you say, yeah, I do?
No, I know what you're saying.
Okay, so that's the question. Do we go and free basically all these other Greek states, or do we be content with the fact that we drove Persia out? Sparta is always on the conservative side. They said, nope, they're out, we're done. We just cared about protecting local Greece, that's all we care about. Since they're gone, we're done. Athens, on the other hand, and remember, Athens is a lot more closely tied, more affiliated with these Ionian cities, so they have more personal ties that way. They want to continue the offensive. So once Sparta drops out, Athens becomes the de facto leader of all of Greece that decides that they still want to continue the war effort. And what the deal was, well, so they set up some sort of alliance for all the Greek city-states where Sparta and Athens were kind of the default leaders. They set up a new alliance now called the Delian League, and Athens is just the default leader of the Delian League. And the deal is, for all the city-states joining the Delian League, is that you need to contribute to the war effort. Now we want you to do one of 2 things. Since we're going to be crossing the seas and going and fighting on a bunch of islands, what we mostly need is a major navy. That was the expensive part of the war effort at the time. So they said to all these city-states supporting him, we need one of 2 things from you. We either need you to contribute ships, contribute vessels, or contribute money so that we can build the ships, and we'll build them if you'll just give us some money. And the majority of the city-states end up going that second route. They contribute money as opposed to contributing actual ships. So Athens takes their money and starts building up its own fleet. So Athens starts accumulating a massive fleet. And they do exactly what they said they were going to do. They go and they start kicking Persia out island by island, liberating city-state after city-state. And at first, it's completely optional whether you want to be in the league. So once they liberate a city-state, the city-state can choose, hey, do you want to continue to help us fight the war effort against Persia, or are you out? And typically they say, no, we'll continue, we'll join, we'll fight. And so Athens ends up having all this money flowing into Athens from all these islands that they're liberating. And at first it's very voluntary, and they start accumulating a massive fleet. And then there's also just the actual war booty that you get from conquering other peoples. So they've got the money from conquering, and at the same time they've got the money coming in from people actually joining the league. And eventually Athens becomes abusive with that and starts leading to people wanting to leave the league, Athens saying no, and that's ultimately going to lead to the Peloponnesian Wars. But the point is, at the time that the Sophists are on the scene, it's when Athens is very much on the rise. Athens is accumulating a ton of wealth, so people in Athens are becoming extremely wealthy. Well, at the same time that this is happening, we also have democracy spreading through Greece like a wildfire. Because Athens, prior to the Grecian-Persian War, was the first one to become a democratic government. And when we say democracy, we do not mean democracy like a lot of times people talk about America like it's a democracy. America is not a democracy. America is a democratic republic. You vote for someone to vote on the laws. You don't go onto the Senate floor and vote on a piece of legislation. You just vote for someone to go do that task for you. So you have a representative who's supposed to represent your interests. In Athens, you, if you were a part of the government, would literally vote on anything you wanted to vote on. You would go sit in the assembly, someone would present legislation to you. If you liked it, you'd vote for it. If you were opposed to it, you'd vote against it. If a man wants to become a general, he has to present himself to the assembly. You vote if you want to be a general. You vote if you don't want to be a general. If a man is on trial and you're trying to decide if he's guilty, you vote if he's guilty or if he's not guilty. Vote to acquit him or not to acquit him. So everything comes down to a vote of the masses. It's a completely democratic system. And you might remember that the Ionian city-states, clear back at the beginning of the Grecian-Persian War, when they were overthrowing the tyrants and starting the Ionian Revolt, one of the things they did was instantiate democracies in an attempt to try and get Athens more involved. They're saying, look, we got the same government, you come help us, we're on the same side. So some people are doing it just to appease Athens, other people it's just starting to spread. People are saying, oh, look at how great this is working out for them, we want it for us. So democracy is also spreading like a wildfire. So in general, a lot of Greek cities are becoming more wealthy, in particular Athens, and a lot of Greek cities at the same time are becoming very democratic. And so that kind of sets the scenes for the Sophists. Maybe one more common phenomena to talk about, common historical phenomena. This isn't specific to Greece. This is just something that happens in history all the time with civilizations that we're talking about. So, common thing with any civilization is you got the civilization. What I'm marking here is like their economic level. I'm going to graph their economic level. What often happens is some peoples adopt some strict moral code of values, which leads their people to prosper. And then as their people start prospering, the population becomes more morally lax, more morally skeptical, which leads to collapse and leads to hard times, which once again can lead to a more conservative, morally stern, what's the word I'm looking for? More morally, more religious people, more moral people, there's an objective standard of morality type people. Strong moral standards people. So over here we're talking about people with strong moral standards, which leads to a boom. Up here we're talking about people with very lax moral standards, very subjective moral standards, very skeptical of any objective moral standards, which often leads to bust. So this is a common situation just over and over again in civilizations across the world. And Greece right now is on this rise. So the fact that they have all this wealth coming in and people, one generation is living much better than the previous generation, it's a very common side effect that leads to population to become to abandon their traditional values. So they're going to start abandoning. They're going to ultimately call them heroic values, I think is what they call them, because it's the values of the old heroes, the heroic virtues. That's what they're going to call them. Anyway, so you're going to see this attack on traditional moral values. You're going to see this push towards skepticism, that there is no such thing as objective moral values, and good is in the eye of the beholder, essentially. If you want an example of this kind of trend, I don't know if any of you know who Will Durant is, famous historian Will Durant. He has a series called The Story of Civilization. In the first volume of that series, he marks out that particular trend that I just erased in India, and he found a nice piece of history where you can actually watch this trend happen 3 times. And the reason it was so perfect with how he caught it is because he caught it in India when there wasn't any major political change and there wasn't any major technological innovation. And so you could, to the best that you could attribute to anything, attribute the rise and fall in the economic situation in India to just the people's moral values. So it seemed like everything else was staying equal, and it was just the moral values of the people. When they had strong traditional moral values, the economy shot up. When they had lax, skeptical, subjective moral values, the economy dropped. And he actually captures a place where you can see 3 cycles of that back to back to back. Now, obviously, you can't attribute some massive social change like that to one feature. It's going to be explained in multiple ways, but that's as good a case study as you can find for anything. So that's probably the example that he uses with India would probably be the most common example used to talk about that phenomena. Other people might talk about in the United States, you look at the 1920s, everything's going great, and the American population becomes more morally lax, that leads to the Great Depression, and then you have the recovery of the 40s and 50s, and people would say that that's probably some of your most conservative American population coming out of that time period, and then you have the hippie movement in the 60s and the recession in the 70s, and people would use this exact same phenomena to help explain some of what's going on there. But lots of examples of it in history. So common trend, and Athens is no exception. So Athens is on the rise economically and politically in power, which means that the population as a general rule is moving away from their traditional values and becoming more skeptical in their values, more subjective in their values. So this is the field that the Sophists are coming into. Now, when we talk about Sophists, we're not talking about a professional class of people. There's a school of Sophists where they all get together and decide what their doctrine is going to be and start laying out their doctrine. A Sophist, at the time when they started, is just a person who's considered a wise man. That's what a Sophist is. If you look at the etymology of the word, a Sophist is just a wise man. If you went back in time to ancient Athens and you asked them for an example of a Sophist, they might say someone like Thales, a wise man. Well, you might note today that Sophist has a very negative connotation. That's because people in Athens started calling themselves Sophists. So it's a class of people that started referring to themselves as, we are wise men capable of teaching you. And so you can already see how that would probably lead to some negative connotation when someone's classifying themselves as, I'm a wise man, now come learn from me. So that's what they were. They're not a particular school, they're a professional class. They're just considered wise people. And what are they doing at this time? They're going from city-state to city-state, teaching Greeks. So at this time, many city-states in Greece are becoming more democratic, so people's political power was often related with their ability to persuade the assembly or the masses. Remember that these are democratic systems. Everyone votes on everything if they want to. Now, what happens before we vote on something is, if I'm for it, I may get up and I may give a speech to you trying to get you to vote for it. Or if I'm against it, I may get up and give you a speech to you to get you to oppose it. So my ability to persuade you to agree with me is absolutely massive. That's where all the political power lies right now. Your ability to manipulate the masses into thinking what you want them to think is 100% what gives you political power at this time. And this is exactly what the Sophists, more than anything, are going to pride themselves on teaching. They are going to be teaching you how to persuade. They're going to be teaching the art of rhetoric. They're going to be teaching you how to manipulate the masses into thinking what you want them to think. That's what they're out to do. They're out to help you gain political power. Yeah.
So Aristotle would be considered like the peak of Sophists.
No. Aristotle is not a sophist in the least. He has a book called Rhetoric, where he teaches the art of rhetoric because it is an art, but Aristotle is teaching everything. And we're going to see some telltale signs of the Sophists. For example, Sophists are going to be skeptics. Aristotle was the complete opposite of a skeptic. So, no, he taught on every art. Persuasion, or rhetoric, is an art, so he taught about persuasion. He taught about poetry. He taught about metaphysics, physics, everything. He literally tried to teach everything. It's crazy what he did. But we'll get to him when we get to him. But no, he definitely not considered a sophist. So not only is that how you gain political power, but now think about being in a democratic state where you're in a law court. You're accused of committing some wrong. How do they determine whether or not you've committed that wrong? Whether or not you should be, whether or not you're guilty or not? It all comes down to the masses. If the majority of the masses votes you're guilty, you're guilty. If the majority of the mass votes you're not guilty, you're not guilty. And so not only did it help you gain political power, but it also helped you avoid political punishment. So you could go through any means you wanted to try and obtain political power, while at the same time have a back door for how you can avoid any punishment, because everything ultimately comes down to these law courts of the masses.
This would be a really good ground for corruption to spring up, wouldn't it? Because you can, I mean, you find one person who has a lot of influence and they can just...
This is why Athens was so politically unstable. We talked about, I just lost his name. The guy at Marathon. Who was the general at Marathon? Miltiades.
Yeah.
Miltiades, within a year of winning that victory, he was kicked out of Athens. So he went from being the hero of Athens to hated by a majority of the people that were voting to kick him out of the city.
Who was the guy that became basically ruler of Athens and then was like sort of the
Pericles?
yeah.
He wasn't exiled. He was found guilty of, what's it called? When you use public funds for personal means.
Embezzlement?
Embezzlement, thank you. He was basically accused of embezzling himself. That's what he was found guilty of, but he died of a plague. So he might have ultimately been kicked out of the city, but him and his sons died of plague in the year the plague broke out. So I don't know how his career would have gone after that, but he definitely fallen out of favor by the time that happened. So yeah, corruption. You can say a lot of corruption, but definitely very unstable political systems. The masses can completely be on board with you one day, and then the next day, you're gone. There were times where they would vote a general off, send him on a mission, and then while he was on a mission, vote him guilty of some high crime, and he should be sentenced to death for it. And so you get word of that when you were a general on a mission, and the place you always ran when you were Greek or you were suddenly in trouble was to Persia. If you ever go through the Peloponnesian Wars and read about a character by the name of Alcibiades, his life is just impossible to follow. He's an Athenian, turned Spartan, turned Persian, turned Athenian. And jumping all sides of this war as the Peloponnesian Wars are going on. And he fights on, well, one of the same sides twice, but he switches sides 3 times. So, just out to get political power. He's your typical successful Athenian at the time where, well, not now, but a little bit after this. Anyway, so Sophists aren't a professional school. They aren't a school of thought. They're just a professional class that go around teaching people basically the art of rhetoric. I'm going to teach you how to obtain political power and how to stay out of trouble politically. I'm going to teach you how to talk in the law courts, persuade people to your side, that type of thing. Now, they traveled around Greece. Obviously, a lot of them ended up in Athens because Athens had A ton of wealthy citizens, and B, they also had a democratic government, a purely democratic government. And so, naturally, that's a place where the sophist services were very much desired. So sophists are traveling all over the place, but a lot of them spend a good amount of time at Athens, a lot of people in Athens who want their services, and they're able to make a good amount of money doing this. So the sophists become pretty wealthy people doing this for their different cities. Now, the way that the sophists are viewed. So even though the city-states are becoming more democratic, when a city-state overthrows one type of government and instantiates a democracy, they then also do like a mass wealth transfer. It's just a political system that changes. It's like, okay, now everybody gets to vote. Everyone who is wealthy is still wealthy. So there's still very much a divide in these cities of the wealthy class versus the poor class. The old aristocracy, the old aristocratic families still possess the majority of the wealth, and then there's still the masses who are relatively poor compared to them.
So did we ever have like a French Revolution thing where all the poor people voted that the wealthy people should just lose what they have?
That was something that happened in particular city-states left and right. So a great example of that is the city-state Miletus. That's one where governments constantly overthrew each other, and the second that the poor people came to power, they instantly went after a bunch of the wealthy families, killed them, took their wealth, and used their wealth to achieve their means. Then the wealthy people come back to power, and they instantly go out mass killing the poor people. Yep. And so a lot of back and forth like that in individual city-states. Yeah. So anyways, since there's this natural disparity between the masses and the old aristocratic families in terms of wealth, it's only the old aristocratic families who are going to be able to afford the sophists. So the sophists find a lot of people wanting them, so there's a huge demand for the sophists. Small supply, huge demand, means that they can charge high prices. They can charge high prices means only the wealthy can afford them. So the sophist, in the minds of your average Athenian, your sophist is this person who helps the wealth keep their power, helps the wealthy keep their power, and helps the wealthy manipulate people like you and your fellow man. So your typical Athenian citizen did not have a positive view of your typical sophist, which is why sophists now have such a negative connotation today. If you go look up the word sophistry in the dictionary, it means subtly deceptive reasoning or argumentation. And there's a lot of other words with sophist in it that have negative connotations. The only one I can think of that has a positive connotation was sophisticated. It's the only word I could find that has a positive connotation that has sophist at true, but all the other ones have a negative connotation. This is why the sophists were very much despised by the general public in Athens. The best analogy I can think of for how to view the sophists is how a typical American citizen might view a corporate lawyer today. What does a corporate lawyer do? Help protect the wealthy from ever getting in trouble for breaking laws that they might use to obtain the wealth in the first place. That's how the sophists are viewed. They're just helping the wealthy maintain their wealth. I mean, obviously the wealthy think it's worth their time to pay these sophists, so they must be making more than they're spending. Okay, so that gives you a good setup for sophists overall, what these people are doing, why there's such a demand for them, and the political setting that they're in. Now, before we continue into some of their actual philosophies and arguments, because you can kind of, even though they're not a consistent school, there are some common themes that work for like 90% of them. So we're going to go over these common themes that work for the majority of sophists, even though it doesn't describe all sophists. And then we'll talk about some particular sophists. Now, before we get to that, there's some words that we need to distinguish the difference between. Make sure you completely understand, because these are words that never go away and become more and more important as we get deeper and deeper into philosophy. And that's the difference between objective and subjective, and then the difference between absolute and relative. So what does it mean for something to be objective?
Your opinion doesn't matter.
It's the truth. We're going to use objective to describe truth. So your opinion doesn't matter, your perspective doesn't matter, your thoughts, your ideas have no effect on it. It is independent of humans. It is what it is, independent of a person. That desk is an object. It exists objectively. You can experience it, I can experience it, everyone can experience that exact same object. What's subjective? Well, right now I'm hallucinating a purple elephant right there. That is not an object, that is a hallucination. You can't experience it, you can experience it, you can't experience it, only I can. It's completely subjective experience. It's only available to me. Your emotions are completely subjective. I can't experience your emotions, only you can experience your emotions. Your thoughts are completely subjective. I can't experience those, only you can experience those. However, the components that make up physical reality are objective components. That's why we call them objects. They exist independent of you. Your emotions do not exist independent of you. My hallucination does not exist independent of you. Objective versus subjective. Feel like we're good there? Any questions there? Okay, next, absolute versus relative. What's the difference between those?
The amount of leeway you have. Absolute meaning.
What does it mean for something to be relative? Give me an example of something that's relative.
Subjective things.
Something might be hard to me, but could be soft to somebody else. Like this chair. I might be used to a really cushiony chair, and I'd be like, man, this is a hard
Right.
chair.
So, relative to the chairs she's used to sitting on, this chair is hard. Or relative to the chairs he's used to sitting on, this chair is soft. Am I tall? I'm taller than some things, shorter than other things. That's a relative term. The common ones in physics are position is relative. We say position is relative. There is no way for you to objectively say, or to assign me some absolute position. Where exactly am I right now? You might think I could give you, well, your latitude, your longitude, and your altitude, and that says exactly where you are. You know, that says where I am relative to the center of the earth. Imagine that you had some magical device that allowed you to communicate with some alien somewhere in space, you have no clue where. And you're trying to tell them, where's Donnie Timpson? Well, then you need to tell them where the earth is. Well, you can tell them where the earth is relative to the sun, but they need to know where the sun is. Well, you can tell them where the sun is relative to the center of the Milky Way galaxy. Well, okay, but they need to know where the Milky Way galaxy is. You can tell them where it is relative to the other clusters of galaxies. But now you need to tell them where the cluster of galaxies are. For all you know, they could be clear and completely a part of the universe where you can't even see that cluster of galaxies. You might say, oh, well, we'll just tell them relative to the center of the universe, right? That's a good place to measure from.
Yeah.
And you might remember we briefly talked about this when we went on a tangent, but the best model we can have right now for talking about the universe is the surface of a sphere. Where is the center of the surface of the globe? There isn't a notion of inside the universe. So, talking about the center of the universe is like talking about the center of the globe.
You can only give it a circumference. Like a line, like an equal.
Yeah, you can talk about distances in space, but you can't talk about a position in space. And we can say the same thing about velocities. Turns out velocity is another thing that's relative, right? I'm standing here and I say, what's my velocity? And you say, I'm not moving. Some clever kid says, no, actually the Earth is rotating around at 1,000 miles per hour. You're not quite on the equator. You're actually up this far, so you're moving at 700 miles per hour. Really? Some even more clever kid says, you forgot that the Earth's also going around the sun, so you got to calculate that velocity too, so you're really going this fast. Some other clever kid says, no, remember our solar system is moving around the edge of the galaxy, so you got to take that into account. And some other kid says, well, actually the universe is expanding and everything's moving away from everything, so you got to take into account that velocity. So how fast am I really moving?
Pretty fast.
The only way you can answer it is relative to what? Another way to help establish your intuition for this, imagine you and I can exist out in space, independent of any oxygen, anything like that. There's just you and me out in space, no stars, no nothing. Complete, empty space. And all we can see is I'm drifting this way, and you're drifting that way. Now, from my perspective, you're just drifting that way. From your perspective, I'm just drifting that way. Who's really moving? The answer is, it's relative. Who's really moving relative to what? Now you'll notice that the laws of physics are the same for you and for me. If there was some object close to us, then how gravity attracts us is how gravity attracts us. And it doesn't matter how we're moving or where we're positioned in space, the law of gravity is the law of gravity. That's something that's absolute. It doesn't vary with your position or your time. It doesn't vary with your reference frame. Absolute doesn't change. It isn't relative. It doesn't depend on anything. It is what it is, independent of however you want to fill that in. relative. It's relative to something. So tall is a relative term. 6 foot 2 inches is an absolute term.
Is there really much of a difference between objective and absolute, subjective and relative?
Yes, there is a difference. Your velocity or your position, your velocity are absolute or objective things. I can measure them. I just have to measure them relative to something. I can't measure them absolutely. I need to measure them relative to something. So your velocity is objective. It's observable. But I just have to say it's relative to something.
But somehow
It is objectively true that right now you are moving 1 mile per hour that way relative to me. Something like that.
there are things that are absolutely true that are objective, right?
There are things...
They're absolute and objectives.
Yes, so chances are your notion of truth is that truth is absolute and objective.
Right.
It exists independent of all humans and it in no way varies. Whatever is true here and now is true there and then as well. Truth is objective and truth is absolute. It's not relative to anything. When I try and calculate whether a particular proposition is true or false, it's not dependent on my position in the universe or anything like that. A tautology is a tautology no matter when, where. It's in no way contingent upon the facts of this universe. So yes, chances are you view knowledge as objective and absolute. Now, skepticism and the skeptics, why are we talking about skeptics when we're talking about sophists? Sophists are going to be the first skeptics that show up on the scene. That's why we're taking the time to say this. So sophists are the first avowed skeptics. So now we're going to talk about what skepticism is. I should have switched the order on that. So what's skepticism? Skepticism is the theory that certain, meaning objective and absolute knowledge, is impossible. There's no such thing as objective absolute knowledge. That's what they're going to say. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Meaning, do you understand it? Not, does it make sense? Meaning, do you agree with it? Okay, so we're going to go over some of the really vague, really wide range arguments that kind of work for the majority of sophists, but there's always going to be exceptions that you can find that, no, that doesn't work for them. But I'll try to give a big overview of how, like an outline that works for all sophists. So their main arguments against knowledge consist in two premises. First, that the sense perceptions are the ultimate root of all knowledge. All our knowledge is ultimately based on our sense perceptions. And then second, that all our sense perceptions are flawed. There's no such thing as a perfect sense perception. So all knowledge has to come through sense perceptions, and there is no such thing as a perfect sense perception. So that's going to be the premises of their argument. Now let's look at a common argument outline, how it might go. So common argument. What we perceive depends upon the object being perceived, right? If I see the globe, that depends on the actual nature of that globe in order for me to perceive it. Somehow my perception depends upon that physical object, the globe. With me so far?
Yeah.
Okay. And the nature of our sensory apparatus. I might be colorblind, I might have bad vision, I might have really good vision. So the nature of my sensory apparatus, the nature of my eyes, the physical condition of my eyes right now, is affecting how I see that globe. So it's dependent upon the physical globe, and it's dependent on my sensory apparatus. And the nature of our sensory apparatus. You and a colorblind man viewing a red rose see it very different. Okay. So each person has their own particular perceptions. So now the big question is, how can you say whose perception is right and whose perception is wrong? How can you say one perception is superior to another perception? Now you might say, let's just go by the majority. The majority of people see the globe as blue with the earth however it is, and we're all describing it roughly the same way. We'll say that that's what it actually is. Well, you see that majority rule can't always work. Imagine for a second that you were talking about a red rose in a city of colorblind people. And let's say it's just you in that city, and that's all that exists. And for some reason, you're the only one with sight, and no one else has sight. Is the rose really gray, or is it really red? That would be one of their arguments. So you can't just go by majority rule, because maybe the majority of people's sensory apparatuses are flawed, and it's only a few that have better ones. But there's no way for us to determine what's better versus what's not better. Maybe my color vision is giving me a false perception of reality when really everything's just gray. And there's something screwed up in my brain that's seeing color when it shouldn't be seeing color. Why is it their brains that are wrong? Why is it my brain that's wrong? So nobody knows the truth about reality, since nobody can perceive reality except as processed by their particular sensory apparatus. And thus, everyone's apparatus affects their perceptual experiences. All we can ever know is the way reality appears to us. Thus, we can make no objective claims. Also, since our apparatus is subject to change, the way reality appears to us now isn't necessarily the way it will appear to us later. Thus, we can make no absolute claims. You follow the overall argument there? That's kind of the major outline for how these arguments typically go. Any questions about any of that? You see the logic?
So, this is kind of taking a little bit different direction, but how does this apply to someone today if you wanted to agree with this argument with the knowledge that we have about physics and the nature of reality? So we say, okay, red is defined as this wavelength of photon, and is that considered objective truth?
So, a couple different pieces there. First off, wholeheartedly, there are people who accept these arguments today. There are people that are skeptics today. Yeah. Second, the experience read and measuring a particular frequency, they'd object to a little bit. They'd say, okay, you call that particular frequency red, but does it really make this color, or does it really make this color? We call it red because of what we see when that photon goes into our eye, hence we name that particular frequency. So yes, it has that particular frequency, and it objectively has that particular frequency, while they'd argue you're relying on other sensory apparatus observations to even come to that conclusion in the first place. But you will see color used a lot as something that's subjective. And when color comes up in all these arguments, because we'll be seeing color as an example even through Aristotle, they are not talking about a photon, because they didn't have that. They're talking about the way that you are experiencing the photon. That's the best way to think about it. Your experience of the photon produces red to your consciousness. You're not actually seeing a red photon. You've never seen a photon, right? The photon just presents red to your eye. That's the way you should keep color in mind when we talk about it, for how they're going to talk about color. And then that makes it back to subjective experience, right? The frequency of light is the frequency of light objectively. Red light is red light objectively. Whether you perceive red when you absorb that photon, how absorbing that photon ultimately presents to your consciousness is a completely subjective experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
All these guys came after Pythagoras, right?
Yes.
Did they accept like logic and math as we know it? So they knew numbers and addition and subtraction, that kind of stuff?
No. They are going to throw out math. Well, the problem is that as they adopt these skeptical views, they don't know the full implications of what it is that they're rejecting right at the start. So modern skeptics, they'll throw it all out. They'll say, you have no clue that 1 + 1 is equal to 2. We'll see as they progress, even as we go from Protagoras to Gorgias, we're going to see a huge acceleration. Protagoras would have had no problem with you saying 1 + 1 = 2. Gorgias, you'll say, you don't know that. How do you know that? So, yep, they'll push back on mathematics as well. And then I thought you were going to say something.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get into this, so you can say, I'll tell you about it later if you want. But I'm wondering what's the counter argument? And
Why are the Sophists wrong?
Yeah.
Well, so Aristotle will take care of a lot of this, but any skeptical position is automatically self-defeating. I say there's no objective truth. Is that objectively true?
Right.
It's already self-defeating. It is so impossible for you to try to rationalize a position that throws out the ability to rationalize. You can't do it. People try to say logic doesn't work. What's your argument for that? Right? And then they got to give an argument for that. What's an argument? It's you logically stating your position. Aristotle tears us apart with people trying to reject the law of contradiction. He'll show left and right that implicitly you have to accept the law of contradiction. So this is how Aristotle is ultimately going to argue for something that he calls an axiom. Not in the math sense. An axiom in the philosophical sense is a self-evident truth. Something that, it's not something you can prove, it has to be a starting point, but something that if you reject it, it's self-defeating. If you say the law of contradiction is not true, then I say, wonderful, the law of contradiction is true. You say, no, I'm not saying it's true, I'm saying it's not true. So it can't be both true and not true? No, law of contradiction, thank you. And he continues this with his other axioms. So he says that's going to be his definition of a self-evident truth. And you'll notice that language all the way up on Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Now, he was being a bit fast and loose, Thomas Jefferson with self-evident. But that's what it means philosophically. It's the same thing as a philosophical axiom. It's not just an assumption. It's more like you can think about it the same way that we have theorems of logic in math, we have axioms in philosophy. And the axioms in philosophy, self-evident truths, to try and oppose them leads to an inconsistent view. So you have to accept them.
Isn't that very, very similar to what an axiom in math is as well, just in a different view?
No.
I mean, the axioms that we accept.
So we have the axioms of Euclidean geometry, and we have the axioms of hyperbolic geometry. They are opposed to each other. It does not make sense to say Euclidean geometry is right and hyperbolic geometry is wrong, or vice versa. Remember, mathematics gives the statements of the form if, then, not since, therefore. We don't say x equals 2. We don't say 2x equals 4. We say if x equals 2, then 2x equals 4. That's the truth that we will claim until we die. That's a tautological implication. So no, math only shows the tautological implications of axioms. Now, math uses logic and presupposes logic. So a theorem in math, or not a theorem in math, something we use in math all the time, if A equals B, then A plus C equals B plus C. This, implying this, nowhere uses any math. This is pure logic. That's just using the law of identity, and that's all it's using. So this is something that every field of mathematics uses. However, the parallel postulate is something only used in Euclidean geometry, and it's not valid in other geometries. That has to be an axiom. This is not an axiom, this is a theorem of logic. That makes sense? I forgot the initial question. Did we answer it? Okay, any other questions? Good? I think we covered this, right? We finished that slide? The basic argument. Some other arguments. Now, while Sophists reject the validity of the senses, they are not rationalists, they are still empiricists. That's important to keep in mind, because some other schools of thought start out in the same place as the Sophists do. So there's a school of thought that's typically called the idealists. And the idealists do the same thing. They say, yep, you can't use your sense perceptions at all, therefore you got to start in reason and just reason about reason and come to conclusions that way, completely ignoring your sense perceptions. Like Parmenides, he's a rationalist. So far Parmenides is right on par with these guys. He says, yep, your sense perception depends on that thing, and yep, all those things are flawed, and that's why in reality there's just this big ball of being, undifferentiated stuff. That's how a rationalist would come at this. Now the Sophists are going to be opposed to Parmenides because they are empiricists, they are not rationalists. They still believe that all knowledge ultimately comes through sense perceptions, and that there's no such thing as just reasoning inside your head without any sense perceptions and coming to knowledge that way. Now you might think, don't you do that in math all the time? I just think about math and I ignore reality and I'm able to just work out that way. But no, you don't, because your basic understanding of math ultimately came from sense perceptions. In other words, here's what's impossible. Take a newborn child in a complete vacuum and have them sit there in that vacuum and come to understand math. Never happens. they'll never come to understand anything.
So you're saying
Your most basic notion, look, let's think about a child when they're first learning to talk. I got my little daughter. One of the first words she learned is puppy, and she points at a dog and she says puppy. She's now learning that puppy applies to that thing. And then she points to a cat and she says puppy. And I say, no, cat, puppy, cat. She is now learning from experience with reality that those are two separate things and they're not the same thing. She is now getting implicitly the law of contradiction in her head. That is a puppy and it's not a cat, that is a cat and it's not a puppy. And if you saw this, you already saw that we can reduce math basically to logic, right? So if you can see how your basic understanding of logic ultimately comes from your senses, your basic sense perceptions is how you come to understand logic, and everything built off of that, you see how logic ultimately comes from sense perceptions. Everything comes ultimately from sense perceptions.
our understanding of it does, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist outside of that.
Oh, it exists outside of that. So Aristotle would say logic has some sort of metaphysical existence. And so there's instances of these metaphysical laws. And you experience those instances through instances, physical particulars. And that's how you come to understand the abstraction. How do you come to understand the abstraction? Cats, by coming across particular instances of cats.
Right.
And that's the only way you can do it. If I tell you, go find me all the goo balls out there, and I make up some weird word, there's no way for you to understand what that word means without any instances to come across with that word. It's completely meaningless until you can come across an instance of it.
So what are the empiricists saying?
So empiricists are the ones that say all logic is ultimately based in sense perception. So Aristotle would be classed as an empiricist. You might, I don't know if you've already come across Plato some. Plato's theory of knowledge has to do with recollection. We'll get into it more next week if you don't already have it, but he's going to be an idealist as opposed to, well, kind of. I can see how an empiricist can make an argument for him. Anyways, so empiricists, knowledge is ultimately based on the senses. An idealist or a rationalist believes that knowledge is ultimately based in, it's a priori. It was already embedded in you somehow, what you need to start learning. And now you can just learn. Okay, so Sophists are completely on the side of the empiricists, which is why they can't use any of Parmenides. They reject Parmenides out there, because Parmenides is a rationalist. Okay, so they still claim that reason is fundamentally dependent upon the evidence of the senses, instead of it being somehow endowed in you already, and that all knowledge is based in the senses. Since we cannot depend upon the senses, we are also unable to depend upon the conclusions of reason. So that's a rejection for being able to just reason to come to conclusions without relying ultimately on sense perceptions. Another argument that they had against the possibility of knowledge is based in the idea that for every proposition, you can make an argument for and against it. You can make a convincing argument for and against it. And so, how do you know which side of the argument is really true? If you can find good arguments for it and good arguments against it, then it must be undecided. Kind of a weak argument, but actually a common argument used all the time by more skeptical people. And so this was actually a skill that Sophists focused on, was teaching you how to argue both sides of a position. And so your more famous Sophists, what they would do is show up to an audience, and they say, pick the topic and pick the side you want me to argue, and then they would display their skills by arguing for that side of the topic. Okay, so I think I gave you a good sense of their basic arguments. Now, give you a basic sense for their ethics. Now remember, the Sophists are skeptics, so there's no such thing as objective knowledge, objective absolute knowledge, and so since Sophists are skeptics, then they're also going to be agnostic. And since they're agnostic, they cannot base their ethics in any sort of religion. Go ahead.
What does agnostic mean?
You don't claim, so an atheist is someone who denies God exists, a theist claims God does exist, and an agnostic is someone who says, I don't know either way. Don't have a position on it. So since the Sophists are agnostic, they can't base their ethics in religion, and since they claim reason is deficient, they cannot base their ethics in reason. So they can't reason about what our ethics should be. They don't have some religious foundation to adhere to, like the Pythagoreans ultimately based their ethics in Orphism, the Orphic religion. So where are they going to get their ethics from? Where are they going to get their human values about how you ought to live and how society ought to be? Well, therefore there is no objective ethics. Virtue is not based in any objective human nature. There's no such thing as objective human nature, but rather is a result of arbitrary social convention. Since good only expresses a preference or a desire, then what feels good for you now is good for you now. If something seems good to you now, it is good to you now. Might not be good for you later. I don't know. See how you feel about it later. And what's good for you isn't necessarily good for me. There's no way for us to know. There's no objective, absolute reality that we can make reference to. No objective, absolute knowledge about ethics.
This is the truth is subjective argument.
This is the morality is subjective argument. Since truth is subjective, then we can't know anything about morality. Therefore, morality must also be subjective. All desires are ethically equal because there's no objective metric to go by. So go by whatever you want. Go by whatever desire you have. The best life is to be in a state of constantly, this is one more specific to just a few sophists. This one isn't as wide-reaching as the other ones, but a common one, that the best life is to be in a state of constantly desiring and satisfying those desires. To be always thirsting and drinking, or hungering and eating. A famous example of this, I think, is in the Gorgias, where Socrates is talking to one of the sophists who thinks like this, and gets him to go so far as to say a good life would be to always be itching and scratching. Having some desire, no matter how base, and always satisfying it. One of the references they make is to a guy who wished that he had a really, really long neck, so that it would take him a long time for the food to go all the way down his throat and he could enjoy it the entire time. To always have a desire and always be satisfying a desire. That is the best ethical life you can hope for. And that's what all human beings want.
And that's pretty much the opposite of what we believe.
Oh yeah, this is terrible. Yeah. If you're thinking, how could they ever, go start reading some Plato, and you'll see how Socrates just has a heyday with these people.
Yeah.
But we'll start out with these people, and we'll start with Protagoras. Now, Protagoras is the first of them, so, go ahead.
Do these guys, are these guys monists, pluralists, or atomists, or what?
Oh, thank you. There's a huge transition now. There's a reason that the Sophists are no longer called Pre-Socratics. So all the Pre-Socratics that we were talking about before, everyone from Thales to Democritus, they were all asking the question, what are the fundamental constituents of the universe? How does the universe ultimately function? What's its metaphysical and physical reality? That's the types of questions that they were asking and answering, and that's why Aristotle refers to them as physicoi, or physicists, is how we would say it now. There's a huge transition now. Rather than talking about nature, how nature is fundamentally, we're now talking about humans, human action, and human politics. So there's going to be this transition from talking about metaphysics to talking about ethics, the individual,
So
and
these
politics.
guys don't really have an opinion or a base on matter. They may have an opinion, but to them it's utterly irrelevant. If you had a sophist as a teacher, and you said, teacher, why don't you teach me about the universe and these other things? How is that going to help you get a political office? How is that going to help you obtain wealth and power in your city? No. Well, not only that.
These are the important things.
Who's to say? Because all it is your perception of it.
Right, who's to say, but their rejection is going to be more along the lines of, it's childish to waste your time with such things. Grow up. This is how you get ahead in the world.
This is like
It's focusing on these things.
modern day society.
So this is a common one this is one, Socrates is even talking to one of the guys, and one of the guys says, look, philosophy, yeah, that's all cute and wonderful when you're young. But there comes a time when it's time to grow up. And stop wasting your time with philosophy and start focusing on what really matters. Rhetoric. Knowing how to manipulate the masses. This is what's important. So they would view those questions as cute, and yeah, it's nice when a little kid asks, how does the moon do that, and how does the sun do that, and they might bother giving them answers. But they say for a grown man to be even considering such things, what is going on in your life? Go get a political office. Go start manipulating people to get your way. Go start having desires and satisfying them. All right. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Do these guys have any conception of the soul?
Any conception of the soul? Yes. I think that. So common Greek belief at this time is going to be, yes, you have a soul, but at the same time, they aren't that on board with the idea of the immortality of the soul. So yeah, you have a soul, that's the guiding principle, or that's the moving principle within you, and it makes decisions. You can't do that kind of stuff if you don't have a soul. They're not all the way over there with Democritus saying, no, you're just atoms in motion. So I'll say, yeah, you have a soul, and the soul is how you act, but it's not this eternal thing that exists forever. They don't have necessarily a notion of when you live, you're going to, once you die, you're going to be punished in the next life, or you're going to be judged for the deeds done in the flesh. Common way of saying it. A lot of them will laugh at that and say, oh, you're letting these child stories scare you into behaving how other people want you to behave. See, that person who tricked you into caring, they were good at rhetoric. They got you to behave how they wanted you to behave out of fear for something that's going to happen when you die. No, nothing's going to happen, and you just spent your life doing what they wanted. No, go trick people to do what you want. That's what they would say about that. Does that answer it?
Yeah.
Sometimes I start answering, I forget the initial question. Okay, any other questions before we get to Protagoras?
So basically their conception of the soul is just your consciousness. It's the way you perceive things.
Yeah, they'd still view, I mean, they would say, obviously, you're not just a physical thing. You also have your consciousness, the thing that moves you, makes you act. And so, yeah, you must have a soul.
Can they be atomists and not like that?
The majority of them are not atomists. We're not going to see anyone really picking up on atomism until we get to the Epicureans.
Well, atomism is pretty objective, isn't it?
Atomism is pretty objective.
Meaning these guys are super subjective. Atomism is very deterministic. Like
Atomism
doesn't
is
matter.
deterministic, so they have, it's a mechanistic materialism. You're just atoms in motion. But remember, Democritus also had a lot of sayings like it's hard to know the truth, because in reality there's just atoms in the void, and look how macroscopic we are compared to those teeny tiny atoms. What do you really know about reality? You hardly know anything about reality. So yeah, there's a reality out there, but you have no experience of it. So you can actually make an atomist position quite consistent with what these guys say.
Really?
They can say it could be atoms, but there's no way for you to know it. Yeah, maybe it is atoms in the void. So what? If it is, there's no way for you to know.
It doesn't sound like they believe in atomism very much. Like that's consistent.
Well, they'd say to spend your time wondering is a waste of time. That would be their response in a nutshell. For the younger ones.
Well, again, what's to say what a waste of time is?
Yeah, you're going to find that any skeptical position is always self-defeating, right out the door. There was a joke as it, so there's like a second wave of skeptics in the Roman Empire, and there was a joke made about them that, you know, a skeptic says something and you say, do you know that? And they say, it's highly probable that is the case. And they say, do you know that? Well, it's highly probable that's highly probable. And then they say, and you keep questioning them, and they're reduced to babbling. That's what they call it when the skeptic goes and stands in the corner repeating, it's highly probable, it's highly probable, it's highly probable, it's highly probable. Because they got to keep tacking that on anytime you question them. So there's a joke about that's how you deal with a skeptic for the Romans when you got the second wave. But with the second wave, they become a lot more consistent. But yeah, these first wave skeptics aren't completely skeptical, and they don't completely follow all the logical implications of their skepticism. They're mostly focused on, I'm teaching you how to manipulate people, manipulate the masses, and get them to think what you want them to think. And that's what they're focused on. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so let's get to the first one. Now remember that the skepticism increases with time. Protagoras is the first of the Sophists, so he's going to be on the very shallow end of the pool when it comes to his skepticism. And you're going to see a huge jump between him and Gorgias. So Protagoras of Abdera. Remember Abdera? I guess go to the map and then point and then explain. Abdera, you're right. Right here. The top dot. That's Abdera. That's the same city that Democritus was from. And they're one of the cities that had it pretty nice, both under the Greeks and under the Persians. because they're one of the cities that hosted Xerxes when he was marching his army. So Xerxes was really nice to them. And then when the Greeks reconquered them, then the Greeks were also nice to him. So it's been a pretty nice city to live in throughout the entire Grecian-Persian Wars, which is probably why we had a few good philosophers from there. Anyways, Protagoras, he's from that same city, but he's going to come to Athens a few times. So he's the first one to flat out call himself a sophist. He says it very straightforwardly, yes, I'm a sophist, and yes, what I claim to do is to teach other men how to be wise men like me. He visited Athens 3 times. He befriended Pericles. On his second visit is where we get Plato's Protagoras. So Plato, he actually has a dialogue called Protagoras. And this is, well, we'll get more into that. We'll actually do a dive into that a bit here. So Plato's Protagoras is supposed to be a conversation between Socrates and Protagoras on his second visit to Athens. On his last trip to Athens, he was probably, some people say not, accused of impiety, and all of his works were burned. Now remember, he was friends with Pericles. Pericles ultimately falls out of public favor, and so Protagoras wasn't viewed very positive, even by the elite when he comes back for a third time. And whether he was actually accused of impiety and his stuff was burned is debated, but definitely not liked come the end. Okay, the dialogue. So we're going to do a decent dive into this dialogue of Protagoras, and there's 3 reasons that we're going to do this. 1, introduce you to the first sophist, i.e. Protagoras. This is one of the main works that we have to reference for his life. 2, once we're done talking about the sophists, we're going to be talking about Socrates. Now, Socrates is set up in opposition to the sophists. Any piece of writing you come across that talks about sophists is also going to talk about Socrates. So this gives you an example. These dialogues are exactly where we get our knowledge of the sophists and our knowledge of Socrates. Furthermore, it's written by Plato, who will cover after Socrates. So it's also a work you would read if you were trying to learn more about Plato. So it's a work that covers Protagoras, a sophist, Socrates, who we're going to cover next, and Plato, who we're going to cover after that. So that's why I thought it would be worthwhile to do a deep dive into one of these dialogues. Give you a notion of where all this information comes from. So we'll go through the Protagoras dialogue. It's not that long if you actually want to go and read it. And you can go read it after this, but yeah, we'll just go through it. So the dialogue, and give you a sense for how these dialogues typically go. And kind of reading like a play and reading a play with a lot of conversation in it. So Plato's dialogue, Plato's writing it. The characters in the story are going to be Socrates, Hippocrates, a bunch of other sophists, including Protagoras. Okay, so let's read the story. So starts with a youth named Hippocrates asking Socrates to accompany him to speak with Protagoras. So Protagoras has just come to Athens. Word spreading, oh my goodness, Protagoras is in Athens. These sophists were very popular people. Everyone knew about the sophists. So Protagoras coming to Athens, he's a rock star for their time. It's a big deal. Word spreads like wildfire. Hippocrates is going to be a youth in this. He's probably going to be around 20 years old. Socrates is going to be around 30 years old. And Hippocrates is a friend of Socrates. So Hippocrates, he's a youth. He hears Protagoras has come to town. It's late at night when he hears. He goes to bed, wakes up early in the morning, runs over to Socrates' house, wakes up Socrates from his sleep and says, Socrates, I found out Protagoras is in town. Will you please come with me to go visit Protagoras and talk to him on my behalf? Socrates agrees. Okay, Hippocrates, yeah, I'll take you, but it's really early in the morning. Let's not bother him. Let's wait a little bit, and then we'll walk over there. So they have a nice conversation and walk over to the house where Protagoras is staying at. Now, in Athens, what would happen when Protagoras, he doesn't live in Athens, he lives in Abdera. When a celebrity like this comes to visit, what typically happens is some wealthy man in the city hosts him, along with a lot of other people. So they kind of coordinate, the sophists kind of coordinate this with each other to all go visit Athens together. So they're going to be staying at the house of Caliphon. Caliphon is just going to be a local, very wealthy man who's basically going to be taking in a bunch of sophists to come stay at his nice-sized manor, and they're going to spend a week there, or however long they spend there. So the sophists can all come there, they can talk, communicate with each other, and then locals can come and visit them. This is one of the things the sophists would do to find new pupils to take on to start teaching. That's how their career worked. That's how they start making money. So Protagoras is coming to Athens. He's looking for students to take on. and become their teacher. Hippocrates is someone who finds out he's coming. Hippocrates is going to be the son of some wealthy family. He's going to be an aristocrat. And he's going to want Protagoras to take him on. He knows Socrates is a friend of his who's very well spoken, and so he wants Socrates to speak on his behalf to convince Protagoras to take him on. So that's what they're doing. So they venture to where Protagoras is staying, and Socrates, speaking to Protagoras on Hippocrates' behalf, says he would like to know what will happen to him if he associates with you. So in other words, he's asking Protagoras, what would happen to Hippocrates if he were to associate with you? What would you do for Hippocrates if he were to become your student? Protagoras replies, young man, he's talking to Hippocrates now, young man, if you associate with me, on the very first day you will return home a better man than you came, and a better on the second day than on the first, and a better every day than you were on the day before that. Now, that's what Protagoras says he will do for this youth if this youth becomes a student. Now, Socrates says, that's a bit ambiguous. I mean, if Hippocrates went to some master flute player to be his student and asked the flute player, what will I be better at? This answer would have still worked. Except for the answer would have been better stated, you'll become a better flute player. But this is true no matter what. So Socrates points out your answer kind of works no matter what you actually teach him. We're not saying, will he improve in something? We're saying, what is it specifically that he will improve in? So Protagoras gives a more thought out answer this time, explaining what it is. If Hippocrates comes to me, he will not experience the sort of drudgery with which other sophists, the sophists are competing with each other to try and get the best paying students, basically. So if he comes to me, he will not experience the sort of drudgery with which other sophists are in the habit of insulting their pupils, who, when they have just escaped from the arts, are taken and driven back into them by these teachers. Arts is a stand-in for all the different fields. We kind of use arts just for painting today, but arts would have been geometry, arithmetic, horseback riding, everything. Everything falls in the arts. Medicine, flute playing, everything's an art. So when they have just escaped from the arts, are taken and driven back into them by these teachers, and made to learn calculation and astronomy and geometry and music, etc. But if he comes to me, he will learn that which he comes to learn. And this is prudence in affairs private as well as public. He will learn to order his own house in the best manner, and he will be able to speak and act for the best in the affairs of the state. In short, he claims he will be able to teach men virtue, justice, temperance, courage, wisdom, and piety. These are going to be the 5 references throughout here. And to teach these men how to become good citizens. Now you'll notice he's not deep on the skeptical end yet. He still believes that these are all 5 good virtues. You teach them these things. And this will enable them to be able to function well politically, as well as be able to manage their own households well. Now, Socrates is pretty nice with him. Socrates demurs, saying that he doubts that virtue can be taught. So this is one of the big claims Socrates makes in a lot of these dialogues. He challenges the notion that you can teach a person to be virtuous. So this dialogue is in that same vein. So he's doubting that Protagoras can really teach anyone to be virtuous. And Socrates has given his argument why. We'll try to highlight some points. When men are met together in the assembly, this is when all the citizens are meeting together to discuss some action the state should take, the assembly. So when men are met together in the assembly and the matter in hand relates to building, the builders are summoned as advisors. If we want to know how should we build some certain structure in the city, we ask builders to advise on that. When the question is one of shipbuilding, then the shipwrights, and the like of other arts which they think capable of being taught and learned. If it's possible, if whatever we're talking about is an art that someone can become a master in, then we go and we find someone who's a master in that art and have them advise the state in this way. However, if other people who you thought were very wise, intelligent people in general, but you knew that they knew nothing about building, got up and tried to advise about building in the assembly, everyone in the assembly would mock them and make fun of them and badger them until they shut up and sat down, right? No, you don't know what you're talking about. Enough of this. So he points out, when it's a specific thing, you go and you get the experts in those fields who have been taught in those fields. This is their way of behaving about professors of the arts. But when the question is an affair of state, a political question, then everybody is free to have their say, evidently because they, the assembly, are under the impression that this sort of knowledge cannot be taught. So for questions of knowledge where you can teach and have experts, then we only allow the experts to teach. But when it comes to political and ethical questions, Athens allows anyone to state their opinion. Socrates says, why? Well, because the assembly doesn't think anyone can be taught these things. So everyone's views, there's no way to rank them, say this one's better than this one. He goes on to say that, notice that the best and wisest of our citizens are unable to impart their political wisdom to others. How often do we see that a really good man has a son that just doesn't even compare? Don't you think if virtue was possible to teach, that a really good man would have a really good son every time? How do we see really virtuous men have very unvirtuous children? Isn't that more evidence that virtue can't really be taught? So these are the first two arguments he gives against the possibility of teaching virtue. Now Protagoras is going to argue against both these. Okay, so Protagoras explains that if every man were an engineer, they would all be welcome to speak on matters of engineering. The reason why any man will be listened to when it comes to political virtue is because every man shares of this virtue to some degree. So Protagoras argues, you got it backwards. It's not that no one's an expert on virtue, it's that everyone's an expert on virtue. Everyone has been taught virtue their entire life, the same way that everyone has been taught the Greek language their entire life. Who's an expert on how to speak Greek? Everyone. Anyone can teach you how to speak Greek. Who's an expert on virtue? Everyone. Anyone can teach you virtue. To some degree. Some might be slightly better and some worse, but anyone can tell you the Greek language. Anyone can tell you what the virtues are. And he goes on to explain even further that the assembly also agrees with him that virtue can be taught. Consider when men act unjust. In such cases, any man will be angry with another and reprimand him. If someone does something wrong, you get after him, right? You tell him they shouldn't have done that. Clearly because he thinks that by study and learning, the virtue in which the other is deficient may be acquired. Do you tell a stone, hey, don't do that? No, because a stone can't change its behavior. Why do you tell a little child, hey, don't hit that other kid? Because you think you think you can correct them and you can fix the behavior. You think that child can learn not to behave that way. So he's going to point out this whole system of reprimanding someone for doing wrong presupposes they can learn to do right, which isn't that learning virtue? So clearly, because he thinks that by studying and learning, the virtue in which the other is deficient may be acquired in punishing injustices. He has regard to the future and is desirous that the man who is punished, and those who also see him punished, may be deterred from doing wrong again. He punishes for the sake of prevention, thereby clearly implying that virtue is capable of being taught. So he's still arguing that virtue can't be taught. Now he's going to take on the case of good men failing to have good sons. And his example here was, imagine that you lived in a city-state where it was just critically important that everyone is a flute player. Everyone has to know how to play the flute, so everyone dedicates a great amount of their time learning how to play the flute. So everyone, when you compare them to your average people out in the world, is an expert flute player. They're already all experts. Now when you compare experts to experts, you're going to notice discrepancies. And there's nothing surprising about a great flute player having a son who isn't as great a flute player as he is. He just didn't have the same natural capacity. So why are we surprised when a very virtuous man doesn't have a son who's quite as virtuous as he is? We say, no, he's an evil son. Protagoras says, no, he's evil compared to these other citizens who grew up learning virtue their whole life. If you were to go up north a few hundred miles, go grab some random barbarian and compare it to that random barbarian, he'd be perfect, I don't even know what to say. He'd be a great model of a virtuous man compared to this other guy. He suddenly looked very virtuous. He has all these political virtues. Talk about that. Talk about that. So in similar manner, all men are teachers of virtue. So, a detail I missed in the flute playing version. So not only is everyone constantly learning flute playing, but you also lived in a society where everyone was constantly correcting you about your flute playing. So imagine you lived in a city where everyone's focused on flute playing, and anytime you make a little mistake, your neighbor to your left or your right says, you screwed up. You're supposed to put your finger here when you had it here. Constant correction all the time. So in a similar manner, all men are teachers of virtue, and each one learns and teaches according to his ability. Asking who teaches man virtue is like asking who teaches man to speak the Greek language. He learns from everyone around him. So we're all experts on virtue. Protagoras goes on to explain that while anyone is capable of teaching virtue, occasionally there may be one who is a slightly better teacher than the rest. And that's what he's going to claim himself to be. So here's his explanation about what it is that he does and how he's a sophist. So a teacher of this sort I believe myself to be, and above all other men to have the knowledge which makes a man noble and good. And I give my pupils their money's worth, and even more, as they themselves confess. And therefore I have introduced the following mode of payment. When a man has been my pupil, if he likes, he pays my price. But there is no compulsion. And if he does not like, he has only to go into a temple and take an oath of the value of my instructions, and he pays no more than he declares to be their value. So no one ever has to pay him what his price is. They can pay him if they want. They don't want to pay, they just need to go into the local temple, take an oath saying that they swear that they only think his teaching is worth this much. And so that's why they're only paying this much. Outside of that, they can pay what they want. So this concludes his argument that virtue may be taught. Now, Socrates is very kind with the first wave of sophists, and you'll see in later dialogues he's very rude with other sophists. So those of you reading the Republic, you might notice how he treats Thrasymachus. It's a lot different than the way he's going to treat Protagoras here. So Protagoras he's still very kind to. He praises. Remember, Protagoras is going to be 20, 30 years older than Socrates, so he's actually very kind to him. Oh, son of Apollodorus. Apollodorus is a father of Hippocrates, the one who brought Socrates here in the first place. Oh, son of Apollodorus, how deeply grateful I am to you for having brought me hither. I would not have missed the speech of Protagoras for a great deal, for I used to imagine that no human care could make men good, but I know better now. Yet I have still one very small difficulty which I am sure that Protagoras will easily explain, as he has already explained so much. And obviously the rest of the dialogue is going to be working out this one problem that turns out not to be one small problem. Now I want you to tell me truly whether virtue is one whole, of which justice and temperance and holiness are parts, or whether all these are only the names of one and the same thing. That is the doubt which still lingers in my mind. So two major positions that Socrates has over and over again. One, virtue can't be taught. Two, all the virtues are somehow the same. It's impossible to have a just man who's intemperate, or a temperate man who's a coward, or a courageous man who's unwise. So he's going to argue that all these virtues have to be tied up together. That's another telltale Socratic position. So far we gave you a good taste of Protagoras. That's what the first part is what I was trying to get out of this. Second part, I want to give you a little bit of a taste of how Socrates works, which is what we're going to get a taste of here in the next part. So Protagoras claims that they are parts of virtue, and that it's possible for a man to be courageous and yet not just, or just yet not wise. No, the virtues are temperance, justice, courage, piety, and wisdom. Sometimes they just list a couple, expecting you to generalize to all five. But they're always talking about all five of these, even if they only list a couple. All right, so now let's get a feel for what Socrates begins. So Socrates then begins his counter-argument. Since the virtues are parts only, then they are different from each other and not the same as each other. Now he typically asks these as questions to Protagoras. He'd say, so you agree that since virtues are parts only, then they are different from each other? Yes. So not the same as each other? Yes. And that's typically how Socrates goes on. He asks questions, getting affirmative answers over and over again, and it's called the Socratic method. Until he ultimately leads him to contradiction. So he can't agree with him. So his initial position must be wrong, or they made a problem somewhere along the way. So there are things that are just, and nothing is more just than justice. Yes. And there are things that are holy, and nothing is more holy than holiness. Yes. And if something is not just, then it is unjust. And if something is not holy, then it is unholy. Yes. Then since justice and holiness are different from each other, then the just cannot be holy, and so it is unholy. Right? And the holy cannot be just, so it must be unjust.
Why right?
Justice and holiness, you said, are different. You said if something's not just, then it's unjust. And if it's not holy, then it's unholy. So holiness is unjust,
Like literally,
and justice is unholy.
But that doesn't mean that,
literally not the same, so.
that doesn't
You're
mean
right.
that one person can't contain both things inside of it.
Yeah.
That well, so far we're
It's
just
like saying you're
we didn't say anything about person. He's talking about the thing in and of itself.
Yeah.
okay.
He's not talking about a just man. He's talking about justice.
Okay.
And so justice is unholiness.
Just being just is unholy.
That's not what we said. Justice is unholiness. Because it's not holiness.
Yeah.
So it's unholiness.
Not necessarily. It's unholy. Unholy being an adjective, unholiness being a noun.
And there are things that are holy, and nothing is more holy than holiness. So anything that's, holiness is the ultimate holy. If something is not just, then it is unjust. And if something is not holy, then it's unholy.
Yeah. So
Right?
just because it's just doesn't mean it's the most unholy thing. Unholy.
But it's still unholy.
It's just unholy.
Since justice and holiness
Are different, that's all.
Are different.
are different from each other, then justice is not holiness.
And so it is unholy.
That's so cool.
It is.
Oh, so it's not holiness so far. The arguments can continue. Oh, no, we're done with this part. I'm thinking of the next part. Yeah, so we're done. Since justice and holiness are different from each other, then the just cannot be the holy. And so it is unholy.
Right.
And the holy cannot be the just, so it is the unjust.
So you are a very unholy person by being justice.
Right. I just wanted to make the distinction that unholy is not equivalent to unholiness.
Right. But holiness is unjust, and justice is unholy.
Right.
All right. Now, this seems to Socrates absurd, and he would prefer to call justice holy and holiness justice. He'd like to say anything that's holy is just and anything that's just is holy, rather than allowing this separation. Now, Protagoras doesn't like this. Protagoras doesn't like calling the just holy and the holy just. He prefers to say that they only resemble each other in some sense. Maybe there's things that are just and holy, and maybe holiness and justice resemble each other somehow, but are yet still distinct different things. So, Socrates comes at the argument from another angle. Because remember, he's just trying to combine all five virtues. Now, he's not going to re-spend his time saying how justice is holiness and holiness is just. Now he's going to come at the argument and he's going to show that wisdom is the same thing as temperance. So he'll combine two other virtues and put them together, since he didn't like his attempt at these two. So Socrates then comes at the argument from another angle. Observe that wisdom is a virtue and that its opposite is folly. Right? We remember that we're translating Greek here, so we unfortunately don't get to read the exact words that they're using, and we have to use our best translations. So just keep that in mind as we're going through that. So observe that wisdom is virtue and that its opposite is folly. Now, when men act rightly and advantageously, they seem to be temperate. Right? Right? Advantageous action is temperate action. And it is a virtue, temperance, that makes them temperate. Right? Any problem so far? Temperance is what makes a man temperate. You are temperate to the extent that you cultivate temperance. And temperance is right and advantageous action. Probably the best way to say it. Now, when men do not act rightly, they act foolishly. Right? If you're not acting rightly, you're acting foolishly. In acting foolishly, they are not acting temperately. Thus, acting foolishly and acting temperately are opposites, or opposed to each other. And foolish actions, and done by R, that should be an R. And foolish actions are done by folly, while temperate actions are done by temperance. So, he's shown that those are opposites. The next part of the argument is going to be saying each thing only has one opposite. Now consider the swift and the slow, two opposites, the strong and the weak, two opposites, the beautiful and the ugly, the good and the evil, and how they are all opposites of each other. And observe that that which is done swiftly is swift, and that which is done slowly is slow, and so on for all the other opposites. Finally, observe that everything has only one opposite, and that which is done in opposite ways was done by opposites. So the opposite of doing something swiftly is to do it slowly, and so the opposite of the swift is the slow. You follow his thinking there?
Yeah.
Since acting foolishly and acting temperately are opposites, then folly and temperance are opposites. But folly is also the opposite of wisdom. Since folly is the opposite of wisdom and temperance, it's the opposite of both of them, and since each thing can only have one opposite, then wisdom and temperance are really one and the same.
But that's assuming that everything only has one opposite.
Yep, it is assuming that everything only has one opposite. Yeah, that's one of the things. It's keeping your knowledge of that helps you get through Aristotle. Because one of the things Aristotle does in his, I can't remember exactly which book, but we just call it the Organ, is he goes through listing all the different ways that things can be opposed to each other. You can have opposites like this, or opposites like this, or opposites like this. And you might wonder, why are you listing the different ways that we use the word opposite? And you won't understand that unless you came across Plato first. And you understand, oh, okay, he's demonstrating very clearly that no, opposite isn't, there's not just one way we use it, and he identifies three basic ways that the word opposite is used. And it's usually one of these three cases. But, yeah, we'll get to Aristotle later. So, at this point, Socrates has shown that justice and holiness are the same, and that wisdom and temperance are the same. He now wishes to try and determine whether temperance and justice are the same. And with all those overlaps, he gets all five virtues. Make sure you see that. So, Socrates has shown justice and holiness are really one and the same. And he's shown that wisdom and temperance are one and the same. And now he wishes to determine whether wisdom and justice are one and the same, combining them all.
Where's piety?
It's courage that we're still missing.
Oh, courage.
Yep, courage is the last one that he tacks on afterwards. So he's doing them one at a time. So combine those two. Now we need to combine these two, and then we need to tack courage onto one of them. I think he tacks courage onto wisdom, if I'm not mistaken.
Spoilers.
But we're going to miss the bulk of this dialogue. We're just trying to give you a feel for it. So at this point, Socrates has shown that justice and holiness are the same. Oh, I said that. At this point, Protagoras is starting to become annoyed with Socrates and looking for a way to get out of the argument. Because over and over again, he keeps having to answer in the affirmative to Socrates, and Socrates keeps leading him to these contradictions. Now, I distilled a lot of conversation into a very small amount of conversation, and we skipped over a lot of details. But it can be quite a tiring process to be interrogated by Socrates. Being asked question after question after question after question after question, slowly leading you down the road that he wants to the contradiction of where you started.
Sounds pretty engaging.
Yeah, the masses, I should point that out that this is a very public conversation that they're having. So, should have mentioned that better. They come into the big room, and Socrates asks Protagoras at first, he says, this kid's considering being your student, do you want to have this conversation here, or should we go talk to someone in private? And Protagoras is like, oh, someone's coming to learn from me. This is a chance for me to show off to my competitors. And so he's like, oh, should we be making a more public scene of this? And Caliphon, the owner of the house, he's like, oh, did you want this to be public? Yeah, we can gather people around. So now everyone's all gathered around listening to this conversation between Socrates and Protagoras. So Protagoras is trying to get out of the argument at this point, but the crowd kind of pressures him, no, keep going. And they all give their big, long, pompous speeches on why it's good that they should keep on continuing the argument, because they're all surrounded by Sophists, all looking for a chance to show off. So Protagoras was no different. He was looking for his chance to show off, and it's kind of backfired on him a little bit. But they talk Protagoras into sticking with the conversation. Let's see where it goes. So he stays. As Socrates begins questioning again, in reply to a question about whether or not the good is that which is expedient for man, Protagoras goes off on a long speech. So Socrates is getting ready to go on again. Common tactic of the Sophists. So Protagoras tries to get out of the argument. Socrates and the crowd don't really let him. Well, Socrates was kind of willing, but the crowd kind of forced both of them to stay. Another tactic that the Sophists would use is, if they felt like they were losing, they would go off on this long tangent of a speech for a very small thing to kind of derail the conversation so that you couldn't embarrass them anymore. So that's what's happening here. So Socrates asks him a simple question about if the good is that which is expedient for man. Something that he's expecting just a nice, easy yes for. And Protagoras goes on with a big, long speech answering rather than just saying yes. I know of many things, meats, drinks, medicines, and tens of thousands of other things, which are inexpedient for man, and some which are expedient, and some which are neither expedient nor inexpedient for man, but only for horses. I removed about half of the speech right there. Continuing, I may, for instance, olive oil, which is mischievous to all plants and generally most injurious to the hair of every animal with the exception of man, but beneficial to human hair and to the human body generally. And even in this application, so various and changeable is the nature of the benefit, that which is the greatest good to the outward parts of man is a very great evil to the inward parts. And for this reason, physicians always forbid their patients the use of the oil in their food, except in very small quantities, just enough to extinguish the disagreeable sensation of smell in meat and sauces. So goes on this whole big explanation to try and derail, saying, yeah, the good is expedient for man. And so, when he gives this, he's surrounded by Sophists who love this type of talk, and so they are all cheering for him and applaud him for his great speech. And Socrates is a bit sarcastic in his reply here. I have a wretched memory, and when anyone makes a long speech to me, I never remember what he is talking about. So he doesn't like that he's giving this long speech. He's like, you'll list out these 20 different things, and we were talking about this, and there's so many places for the conversation to go. Socrates requests that Protagoras try to keep his replies simpler, or otherwise Socrates had best be off. He mentions that he has other business that other people are actually waiting for him, and right now he's just staying because the crowd's telling him to. And now you're dragging this out to the point where it's pointless. No point staying here. The company plead with him to stay and press Socrates and Protagoras to compromise so that the conversation may continue. Well, I think you have a good enough sense for what's going on here. And so the conversation continues, but they decide, okay, we're going to switch things up. Rather than Protagoras sitting here being drilled by Socrates, we're going to switch around. And the conversation continues with Protagoras drilling Socrates about a poem. Now, remember that education in Greece, philosophy isn't really its own standalone field yet. That doesn't really happen until Plato sets up the academy. And so your basic education in Greece is about poems and your physical education. You get a lot of your education about how the way things are through poetry. And so a common way to demonstrate that you're a well-educated Athenian is to give your interpretation and explanation of some piece of poetry. So Protagoras is now going to drill Socrates on some particular piece of poetry. And a lot of conversation about that. They go through it. Socrates answered everything to their content. Socrates then asks if Protagoras still thinks the virtues are many. I think I missed something. Socrates. Oh, so then it goes back to Socrates' turn. So Protagoras drills him out this poem to his heart's content, and that's the end of that. Now back to Socrates talking to Protagoras, because Socrates says, Protagoras, fine, I'll answer questions until you're done asking him, and then we'll switch back and I'll ask him, you have to answer. So now it's back to Socrates. Socrates then asks if Protagoras still thinks the virtues are many, to which he replies that wisdom, justice, temperance, and piety may all be the same, but courage is for sure something different. So he's going to accept this picture so far, but he won't let you attack courage on you. He's still going to fight there. Socrates then goes on to prove that courage and wisdom are the same thing. So I was right, that's how he connects it. That's the majority of the dialogue, so we won't try summarizing that in any small amount. Here's a taste of how the argument goes to give you a sense of the actual verbiage when Socrates is drilling one of these people. And the courageous man has no base fear or base confidence. True, he replied. And if not base, then honorable. He admitted this. And if honorable, then good. Yes. But the fear and the confidence of the coward or foolhardy or madman, on the contrary, are base. He assented. And these base fears and confidences originate in ignorance and uninstructedness. True, he said. So you see how he leads them line by line, answering questions. That's a very small part, but it'd take you like probably 25 minutes to read this part of the dialogue. And they go all the way through, so Socrates proves to his content that actually courage and wisdom are also the same, therefore all the virtues are connected. Socrates talking basically at the end. In fact, I think this is the very end of the dialogue. So Socrates says, okay, we've gone through all this, now we've established that courage is also a part of this picture, like this. And now Socrates is going to give a voice to the conversation that they've been having. And basically what he's going to say is, oh, silly Protagoras and Socrates, in all this conversation, look at what you've admitted. That all the virtues are the same thing as wisdom, and if anything can be taught, wisdom can be taught, which is what Protagoras was saying, whereas Socrates was saying wisdom can't be taught. So Socrates says, you can't teach virtues, but everything's wisdom, which means shouldn't it be able to be taught? Protagoras says, no, the virtues are all different, but you can teach all of them. But shouldn't they be the same as wisdom if you can teach them all? So Socrates is just pointing out that fact before he goes on his merry way, having fun with this. So this is Socrates talking, giving voice to the argument. Protagoras and Socrates, you are strange beings. There are you, Socrates, who were saying that virtue cannot be taught, contradicting yourself now by your attempt to prove that all things are knowledge, including justice and temperance and courage, which tends to show that virtue can certainly be taught. For if virtue were other than knowledge, as Protagoras attempted to prove, then clearly virtue cannot be taught. But if virtue is entirely knowledge, as you are seeking to show, then I cannot but suppose that virtue is capable of being taught. Protagoras, on the other hand, who started by saying that it might be taught, is now eager to prove it to be anything rather than knowledge. And if this is true, it must be quite incapable of being taught. And then Socrates wishes Protagoras to help him finish the argument. He wants to keep continuing the argument back to their initial question, can you teach virtue? And the dialogue ends here. So last line, nothing ever gets figured out. Oh, it's not the last line. There's actually a couple lines after it where Protagoras says, Socrates, I admire how you're going at this. I'm just done. Maybe some other time. And Socrates says, that's okay. I've got something I've been putting off anyways. I gotta go. But common theme in Plato's dialogues, you have the main question, side conversations come up, they get back to the main question never gets resolved. So a common sense with one of these dialogues is, you think you know something, Socrates points out you don't know it, but neither does he.
Yeah.
And so, at least now you don't know. Or at least now you know that you didn't know what you thought you knew. So, yeah. So going through these dialogues, they're a ton of fun, and you can see why they're a ton of fun. They're fun to read. They're not that hard to read. I mean, hard relative to your typical high school reading, easy relative to actual rigorous reading out there. Like, if you could get through 5 pages of our analysis book, you could get through 500 pages of Plato, no problem.
Those 5 pages are pretty hard.
They are pretty hard. But if you can get through them, then you can get through Plato, no problem. So it's not super dense, rigorous material. You've read a lot of what's actually being said. Sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the language simply because they use it slightly different, or you just kind of need some background knowledge that helps put it in the right perspective. So if any of you are reading these, feel free to spend class time asking questions about, hey, I was reading this and this came up and I wasn't sure about this. because that can often happen with the way they use terminology. But so we'll end there with Protagoras. I gave you a feel for the first skeptic. Oh, I did put the last lines in there. So the last 2 lines of it. Socrates, Socrates, I am not of a base nature, and I am the last man in the world to be envious. I cannot but applaud your energy and your conduct of an argument. As I have often said, I admire you above all men whom I know, and far above all men of your age. Remember, Protagoras is probably like 50 here, Socrates is probably like 30. And I believe that you will become very eminent in philosophy. Let us come back to this subject at some future time. At present, we had better turn to something else. And then the last line. By all means, I said, if that is your wish, for I too ought long since to have kept the engagement of which I spoke before, and only tarried because I could not refuse the request of noble Callias. He's the one whose house they're staying at. He's the wealthy one, where everyone's staying. So the conversation ended, and we went our way. So the conversation ended, and we went our way. This is because the common theme of these dialogues, what's really happening is 2 people are having a conversation. One of them is recalling a conversation that he was at where Socrates was present. So this is the person who is telling the story finishing it up. So it's written from the perspective of someone present at the conversation who didn't actually talk at the conversation, telling some other unnamed person. And that's very common. And often the dialogues are named either for the main person in the dialogue that's against, like Protagoras, or named for the person speaking in the dialogue. So Phaedo is called Phaedo because Phaedo is the one telling some stranger about that conversation. You might think, why is this called Phaedo? Phaedo, by the way, is a dialogue where Socrates lives out his last day. His friends come. They have a conversation while they're waiting for him to take the hemlock. He takes the hemlock and he dies. That one's a Phaedo. So you might wonder, why is that one called the Phaedo where Socrates dies? Well, because in the dialogue, it's Phaedo talking to a stranger, and Phaedo happened to be at the conversation where Socrates was. And the whole dialogue is Phaedo talking to some stranger about what happened.
And really all this is just Plato writing it down.
And all of this is just Plato writing it. Good chance that a lot of this is fabricated. By the time Socrates dies, Plato, I think, is 20. And Plato, in all his dialogues, only ever mentions him actually being there once. And that's at the Apology. That's Socrates' actual trial. And you'll notice that that's one that's not named after someone. It's just called the Apology. It's not called Cryo, Phaedo, Euthyphro. Those are the other 3 about Socrates' life. So, yeah, that's the only one that Plato was actually at. Now, Plato's older brothers, Glycon and I'm blanking on the other one. Plato has 2 older brothers that are really close with Socrates, and so they're often mentioned there as being in some of these conversations. So some of these conversations could be somewhat historical in their themes and how they went. This is one that's viewed to be on the more historical side. The general rule is people think Plato's early dialogues captured some real Socratic conversations to some extent. Obviously, there's a lot of embellishment and lyric choice. And then the later ones are just Plato using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own philosophies. And then in his later ones, he doesn't really even use Socrates as a mouthpiece anymore. Socrates is just present, and he picks some expert in the topic he wants to talk on that. So
really, you don't even know Socrates is a real guy, honestly.
Well, that depends on what you're going to call know. Remember that knowledge, when we're talking about in fields of science, is always probabilistic. Do we know the laws of physics? Depends on what you're going to say no.
Right.
According to the standard we have for the laws of physics, yes, we know the laws of physics, that's why we call them. It is historical fact that Socrates was a person. We have as much evidence for his existence and more than we have for the majority of people we accept as having lived. So, Socrates lived is a historical fact. Does that make it true with capital T? No. Same way that Einstein's general relativity is true. Is it true with capital T? No. So, we don't only have these dialogues referencing Socrates. We have these dialogues referencing Socrates. Aristotle referenced Socrates same way that he referenced all the Pre-Socratics. Some of the other people that followed Socrates around mention him, some of his other followers, and give similar presentations the way that Plato does. So Plato gives his version of the Apology, and then there's Zeno, I think is his name, different Zeno than the Zeno we've talked about, gives his version of what went on in the courtroom, and so there's some overlapping there. But yeah, some people argue Socrates didn't ever live, same way some people argue Jesus never really lived. How do we really know? It's historical fact. I mean, if you're going to argue about that, okay, did Julius Caesar really live? Was there really a Cleopatra? We have a lot more evidence for them than we have for Cleopatra. So, you got to draw a line somewhere where you're going to start accepting it as true. So yes, Socrates is historical fact. Anything else? I think we'll kind of call it there for tonight. That ends the dialogue Protagoras. We haven't actually gotten into Protagoras outside of that dialogue yet. So we'll start by talking about Protagoras again next time, cover his more general philosophical views rather than just what's talked about in this dialogue. I just thought this dialogue would be a great one to give you a taste of both Socrates, Plato, and the Sophists in one. And if you want, you can go read the Protagoras before next time, and then we'll talk about it. Have fun. Okay, so any questions? Those of you who want credit, stay. The rest of you, see you next week.